So in the last video, I talked a little bit about executive orders. Well, what exactly are those? Well, until the 20th century, presidents found themselves ill-equipped to intrude upon administrative practices. Congress exercised oversight of the bureaucracy, assigning its committees jurisdictions that matched those of the federal departments. Presidents simply stayed in the background and attempted to influence policy through political appointees to the bureaucracy or through the issuance of these executive orders. Executive orders are supposed to be a formal instruction from the president to the bureaucracy telling other members of the executive branch how he interprets congressional acts and how they should act on his behalf. They were originally intended to be bureaucratic documents merely clarifying exactly what laws meant and the nuts and bolts of enforcement, but they have expanded in recent years. A second class of executive orders is based not on some explicit congressional delegation, but on presidents' assertions of authority implicit in the Take Care Clause of the Constitution. Not until the 20th century did presidents begin seriously to entertain the notion that this general language might give them more authority than their predecessors had claimed. Teddy Roosevelt was the first to subscribe to this expansive view of the office, and the expansion has continued since then. This is similar in nature to the general authority given to Congress under the Necessary and Proper Clause, and has led to a significant expansion of the president's power. So now that we've outlined the president's power, I want to spend a little time talking about the collective action problems we have through the bureaucracy and some of the president's work. The first collective action problem we're going to talk about here is an issue with agency loss through delegation. By delegating to the president and the appointed executive branch the discretion to decide how best to implement and adjust policy to achieve its objectives, Congress has effectively shared its lawmaking powers with the president in a way not envisioned by the Founding Fathers. When members of Congress write public laws, they can decide to delegate a little or a lot of the rulemaking authority to the president. The more they delegate, the more freedom the president has to interpret the laws any way he wants. I have a great quote from President Taft here saying, "Let anyone make the laws of the country if I can construe them." Taft knew the power of being the one to interpret the laws, being able to decide what they mean, and how to enforce them. A great example of this, or I shouldn't say great, but a powerful example of this, is the Southern governors ignoring the 15th Amendment and the consistent attempts to try and ignore the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act in the massive resistance era. The government told states to allow black people to vote, but when the governors controlled the police force and those who executed the law, they could continue to discriminate as much as they wanted until the federal government would finally force their hands 100 years later. At times, Congress delegates less from programmatic necessity than to gain political advantage. When would they do this? Well, one time when this would happen is when they agree on the goals of a bill but disagree on its specifics. Congress then can make the law vague, and the executive branch has a great deal of leeway in how it implements that law. For example, Congress delegated to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service discretion to establish rules for classifying species as endangered and threatened. Congress gets all the credit for saving the animals, and we get a reprieve from Sarah McLachlan for a while, and the president gets all the headaches of actually figuring out how to handle these sorts of things, negotiating the headaches of deciding which animals are endangered and threatened, how to protect them, what we do, etc., etc. It's a pretty significant headache given all the sort of interests and competing goals here, and Congress is more than glad to take credit while passing the hardest work on to the president.